mic. Yeah. All I need is one mic. Yeah. All I need is one mic.
Hey everybody, welcome back to One Mic, where I watch shit so you don't have to. And today I'm here to talk about episodes 1, 2, and 3 of the new Apple TV series entitled Pachinko. Pachinko is named after a pachinko parlor that one of the characters' fathers owns in the show, and also in the novel. Pachinko, you probably, if you're anything like me, you recognize it from The Price is Right. It's that game where they had a big board with these like pegs that came out of it, and the contestant would go behind that board, climb up to the top, and they would drop like this, like a circular peg or something down, and it would bounce on the pegs, and then if it landed in a certain spot, they would win whatever was in that spot. That's kind of well, that's not kind of, that's exactly what it is, just on a smaller version. Think of it in like like the size of a slot machine in a casino. That's what the characters play on it in this one character's father's parlor. So that's where the show's named after. I'm unclear at this point as to why the show and novel are named after this game, because the game has yet to have any real relevance within the show, other than the fact that it's just it's a parlor that's owned by one of the characters' fathers, and he in these 3 episodes he buys a second one, and I think maybe some problems could arise from that because it involves getting a bank loan in order to do it. But we're not there yet, so we'll talk to that when we get to it. But for right now, I want to talk about, in a non-spoiler way, these first 3 episodes, because this show is something that's very different than what you typically see in television. It's very wide in scope. It feels kind of like The Godfather Part 2. You have young Michael Corleone's story that happens here. Well, not here, but here, and then in Sicily. But then you also have, I think it was Sicily. It was Sicily, right? I don't know. It's been so long since I've watched it. But then you also had his father's backstory. Marlon Brando's character, who was played by Robert De Niro as a young man, you have his story as well. And it shows like the entire scope of this family's heritage and what all they've been through, and helping you gain a little bit more context into how they ended up in the place that they are in present day within the film. And this show kind of has that same vibe, right? It takes place in 2 different eras. It's like a 1910. I think it's 1915 is when we first start, but we spend most of these first 3 episodes in around, I want to say like 1924, 25, somewhere in that range. And that's where we spend most of that time period, is in the 20s. And then we spend most of the what I'm going to refer to as present day, because I don't think that any of this is going to take place in 2020. I think present day within the context of this show is 1989. So that's where we spend most of our time, is in these two time periods. And the older time period, the one that's in the 1920s, takes place during a Japanese occupation of Korea, which is something that I didn't know about. And I'm glad to be watching, this is just kind of like a tangent here, I'm glad to be watching shows that provide me with the histories of other countries that you just don't hear about commonly. Like, you know, if you go into school and you take history classes, you're really just hearing about American history. like you hear about things that happen in other countries, but usually within the context of of America's involvement. You don't really hear about what other countries had to go through. And you think of, like, when you think of here, you think of like slavery and things like that, the tortured history that we have here. But we don't have a monopoly on shitty history and terrible things that we want to either pretend like they didn't happen or try to move forward from. We don't own that. Other countries exist. I know it's hard for Americans to really sometimes grasp the fact that other countries exist. It outside of the context of like they literally exist, and then we might, you know, have interactions with them, whether that's business, whether that's war, whatever. But like they exist in the same way that we do, in that, you know, we live here and this country has a very tortured history, and other countries can have that too. And there's been a lot of things that I've been watching lately that have kind of like enlightened me into what other countries, or even like looking at Atlanta just this past, you know, Thursday, the history of just of Atlanta alone, you know. So it's like it's cool, I think, for me to be learning about these other nations and what they've dealt with, and thinking like and realizing like we don't own, like I never was oblivious enough to think that like we somehow are the only country that has a history, let alone a tortured history. But when you see the details of this and what this looked like, you think, man, they had some shit just like we did. It's interesting to watch, and I think it's not just interesting but also important to learn about these other big moments in history. And yeah, apparently there was a Japanese occupation of Korea, and it very much mirrored what we had here during like slavery and like the Jim Crow era, where it's very racist. It's very like, the Japanese look down upon the Koreans. They treat them like shit. It's very like very much like the white-black dynamic that was going on here. There's a lot of time spent in this fish market. And I'm going to talk about the fish market in a little bit, but to give some context about what it was like there, you have a bustling fish market. All these Korean people buying and selling living fish. It's a very alive place. But whenever the Japanese police come through, they all nod their heads and get silent and don't move. And it's very interesting to see just what it was like back then. But and in 1989, we see that a lot of these characters that exist in Japan are actually from Korea or were born in Korea, and they yearn to go home and have never been back. And that's an interesting thing too. Like, people bailed out of out of Korea, sometimes probably by force, and were just never able to go back. And these people yearn for their home. And I think that's something that anybody can relate to who watches this show. But one of the things that I want to talk about as it pertains to the Japanese occupation of Korea is that the show is subtitled very interestingly. You have a few moments where there's English speaking, so you don't need subtitles. But when you have one country that kind of occupies another, and you have that blending, that even unwillful blending of multiple cultures, the languages start to blend together as well. And they have captions color coded. They're blue for when characters are speaking Japanese, and they're yellow for when characters are speaking Korean. And you might think on the surface, like, why do I really need that? Because all I need to know is what they're saying in English. But I think it's really interesting to see how the languages blend. Like, you have characters in 1989 who will use words from each language within a sentence. Like, they'll have speak a sentence in Korean, but we'll have like 3 or 4 words that are in Japanese. And you'll also, they use it very creatively too. Like, they'll have moments where characters will go back and forth between languages. Like, it's something that helps you realize, like, culturally, how when one country occupies another, sometimes you're almost kind of forced to take their culture with you. So a character in 1989, Solomon, he uses Japanese just as much as he uses Korean. He's a Korean guy, but he was raised in Japan, and he speaks both languages, and he uses Japanese to an effect. Like, I don't want to, like, again, spoil some of the wonderful things that happen on this show, but they're very intentional with how they use the captions, and the characters are very intentional with how they use language. And I've never watched something where somebody who is, it's even hard to describe, because where would this ever happen? But where you can actually have shocking moments that revolve around what language a character is speaking. But this show does that with their wonderful use of the color-coded captions, so that you know when someone is speaking maybe their natural language versus the language that was forced upon them. Or maybe they don't even know their natural language because they spent their whole time doing Japanese. So yeah, it's really interesting how they use captions. I love that about this show. Another thing I love about this show is the opening credits. The opening credits are kind of like Peacemaker almost, in that it's not really, actually it's like Peacemaker in that you are seeing characters who are in the show dancing, and they're clearly out of character. This is not a happy-go-lucky show here. These characters are dancing, and they're happy, and they're smiling, and you don't see any of that in the show, which is how it's different from Peacemaker, because tonally the Peacemaker intro is very upbeat, and the show is generally, it's funny, it's got action, so it's not really a clash tonally. But so that's what makes it different from Peacemaker. But what makes it similar is that you are seeing characters doing dance numbers, and that just doesn't fit into the show. It fits even less into this than it does into Peacemaker. But it is similar in that they have dance numbers, and these characters are not happy-go-lucky characters who have lives that make them want to dance. But I do think the opening credits are really nice. Another thing about this show is the locations. Beautiful locations everywhere. Like I said at the beginning when I was talking about the different time periods and how it's so big in scope, like The Godfather Part 2 was. We're in very different places at different times, and they all look gorgeous. These things look like they're filmed on location. Like, it's not like, these aren't green screens like The Mandalorian, where like virtually none of what you see is real. This is more like Lord of the Rings, how like they were filming like in New Zealand and you get these beautiful landscapes. This is what you get here. And I really love the fish market stuff that I talked about earlier. The fish markets, it feels like you're there. Like this is what a fish market was like in 1920s Korea. Like, that's what it feels like. But it's pretty cool, and it's beautiful to look at. And the music complements it well, as well. And again, another thing that I kind of like tie to the Godfather series is how they use music to elevate scenes and the Godfather theme itself even. And this show does that very well too. It takes the music and it just uses it to kind of like just really successfully elevate what you're seeing on the screen. I just talked about The Mandalorian, but The Mandalorian does that really well too. The acting is off the charts in this show. You have the show mainly revolves around a character named Sunjo. She's the one where I said it kind of like starts in around 1915 with like her birth or something. I think she was born around 1915. Then I think we spend some time with her. Looks like she's about like 6, 7, 8 years old. So I will put that as like the early 20s. And then, but most of the time we spend with her, she's a teenager. So I would say that's probably in the late 1920s. The actress who plays her as a teenager is apparently a newcomer. I don't know any of the. Well, I do know a couple of them by face, but there's a lot of actors on this show that I don't know. But this one I don't know because she's a newcomer and she's fucking incredible, man. Like this woman is remarkable. Like I said, I don't want to spoil. There's one scene that I'm going to talk about specifically that I guess you could. I don't want to call it a spoiler, but I think it's just it's a good example of how this show takes something that feels small and makes it really emotionally impactful. But I don't want to get into too many details about the performances specifically, but the woman who plays her as a teenager and the woman who plays her as an elderly lady who I believe she won the Oscar for Minari last year, they're incredible. They're fucking incredible. And I don't really want to go into spoilers. I don't really want to call them spoilers, but it is based off a book, so I guess they're kind of not spoilers. But it's an 8-episode series, so we've got the 3 right here. So these remaining 5, I will go into detail about. We could talk about some of these scenes specifically, but right now, I don't really want to talk about the scene specifically, but I will just say that the actress who plays the teenage version of Sunjo and the older, elderly version of Sunjo, they're both absolutely incredible, man. These two are doing some great stuff. There's another character named Kohan Soo, who we see. He's kind of like a badass. He starts running the fish market at a certain point. He's really likable for the people who work at the fish market business-wise, but as a person, he's kind of a dick. He forms a relationship with Sunjo throughout these first three episodes that, again, I'm not going to bother spoiling. It's their relationship takes an interesting turn. I've already kind of like slowly transitioned to talking about some of the characters. I mentioned Solomon earlier. He's the one that we see in 1989. He's Korean, but raised in Japan because of the aforementioned occupation. And he's very much a modern day kind of guy. Like, you could see a guy like this in 2020, even though this takes place in 1989. He's less concerned with his culture and his history and what he represents as a Korean person. All he's concerned with is being successful regardless of his race and just being the next big thing and making a whole lot of money. He doesn't deal well with people. And his storyline within this show, at least so far, it's necessary for him to have that cultural connection. And he has to bring in another character to help aid with that. And he continues to shoot himself in the foot because not only does he not really know or acknowledge his culture and history, he doesn't even really seem too concerned with it. He's not interested in building a relationship or having a conversation with somebody using culture and history and their past. So he has to recruit somebody else to do it because he's just not too concerned with it. He's a good dude. I'm making him sound like a dick, but like he's just a very modern day guy who's not concerned with their history. Whereas like the older people in the show in 1989, that is who they are. That like there's nothing else for them to be concerned with. So it's a very interesting contrast between how the older people interact with one another versus how they interact with Solomon. But again, we'll save that for, well, you guys can save that for when you watch it. But we'll save that deeper conversation for these future episodes. And then the main character, Sunjo, like I said, we see her as a kid, most of the time as a teenager, and as an elderly woman. Like I said, the actress is incredible. I would imagine we're probably going to see them at this age for most of the series. There might be, I could see us having like an actual fully grown adult version of Sunja that we might see in these later episodes as well. Like, you know, a version that's in like, say, like her mid-20s or early 30s, something like that. But again, remarkable actress. Like I said, the older version is played by the woman who I believe won the Oscar for Minari last year or the year before. And there's a great scene with her. And this is the scene that I'm just going to talk about very briefly, but I'm not going to provide all the context. I'm just going to say this character is brought to tears eating rice. I don't even want to really explain it to you because me trying to verbalize it takes the power out of the scene. If I try to verbalize it and then you watch it, it's not going to be the same. If I try to verbalize it and you don't watch it, you're like, I don't understand why that scene was so great. But there's a character, it's a very evocative scene, and it's carried by this actress, and she does an incredible job in this scene, but it's a very moving scene. And it's a scene that, again, when you look at somebody like Solomon could never have that moment because he isn't concerned with that. He didn't even experience it. Whereas the older Sunja, the elderly Sunja, she has experienced so much, most of which we have yet to see, that makes just having a bowl of rice from her home, I am spoiling it a little bit, it's a bowl of rice from Korea, and they talk about like the difference in the taste of like actual Korean rice from Korea as opposed to rice in Japan. Like it sounds dumb on the surface, not dumb, but it doesn't sound as intriguing on the surface as it is when you watch it. But it's a great scene, and this is a show that relies heavily on its beauty and its ability to evoke emotion and having interest in the journey that these characters go on. So I think it's really great. I'm going to continue to watch it. I'm going to cover it every week on this channel. I hope you guys will watch it and follow it with me. This could be one of those shows that we're talking about at the end of the year is one of the best ones that we have. And it's something that's so much effort is being put into this to making it feel authentic, making it feel real, making it evoke emotion like this, and just trying to put together this perfect package of a show that is at its core fairly simple, but it's just about the people. It could use, if I wanted to poke at it, it could use a stronger narrative, something that's a little bit more compelling. Because when I compare it to The Godfather, you got, even though The Godfather is very similar in virtually every way that I just mentioned, you still got that gangster shit from The Godfather. You still got the mafia, you still got the violence, you still got the chess games that they play with each other as far as business goes. And it's a little bit more compelling. So if I did want to poke at this, I could say the narrative could get a little bit more compelling. But I think after these 3 episodes, the direction that we're going and the time period that we have yet to explore between teenage Sunja and elderly Sunja, I think we're going to get some really cool stuff. So I'll be following this every week. I hope you will too. And until next week, peace.